on September 26th, last Sunday, which this election represents an important moment in German and European Union politics as we are moving on into the post-Merkel era. So to discuss the outcomes of the elections, we have with us three highly respected scholars from Canada and Germany that will provide an analysis of the results and possible short and long-term implications for Germany and the European Union. Before I introduce the panelists, just a few admin issues. We'll have quite a lot time for a Q&A. I would ask you to pose your questions either in the chat or by raising your small electronic hand, and you will be given the right to pose your question directly. Each panelist will have about 10 to 15 minutes of opening remarks, so we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So without taking your time and the panelists' time, I will briefly introduce the panelists in the order of speaking. So I'll start with our own Achim Harelman, who is a professor of political science and currently serves as chair of the department. He is the co-director of the Center for European Studies, which is a Carleton University research center, and is cross-appointed to the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. His scholarly work focuses on the politics of the European Union, with a particular interest in political discourses about European integration, democracy and legitimacy in the EU, as well as Canada-Europe relations. We'll continue with Heather McRae, who is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at York University in Toronto. Since 2018, Heather has served as president of the European Community Studies Associations Canada, and from 2014 to 2017, she held one of the European Commission Jean Monnet chairs. She is currently also co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies. Her research interests are Europeanization, the politics of the EU, gender regimes, and German politics. And finally, Arthur Benz is a professor emeritus at the Institute of Political Science, Technical University of Darmstadt, Germany. He was a visiting scholar at Carleton University in 2007-2008, a research fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies, University of Constance in 2014-15, and RSSS fellow at Australian National University of Canberra in 2018. His research has focused on German politics, comparative federalism, multi-level governance, and institutional change. In 2007, he received the John Diefenbaker Award of the Canada Council of the Arts, and in 2018, the Publius Distinguished Scholarship Award for his research on comparative federalism. So with that, Achim, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Krina. And this is quite a special event for me. It's the 5th time that I have the chance to comment on German federal elections here at Carleton University. The first time was really at the very beginning of my association with Carleton, when I was here as a visiting scholar and didn't know that I would end up here for more than just 4 or 5 weeks. So it's quite special to do this. I don't usually work on German politics, or at least normally Germany is at most a case in comparative design for me. But it has been quite special to do these events, and I've always enjoyed them. And I want to particularly thank Krina for encouraging us to have an event this year, because I was not really getting my act together because I was so busy with other things and thought, well, maybe I'll skip this election. But Krina encouraged us to have this event, and I think it's great. And it's good to see so many people here, and also so many familiar names of people who I haven't had a chance to meet in a while. So that's fantastic. Let me share my screen to begin my remarks then. There you go. Let me just get ready here myself. So my question that I want to raise here is whether this election is indication of a social democratic revival. We have been speaking across Europe for many years of a decline of social democracy. But in this election on Sunday, something quite remarkable occurred. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, or SPD, was the one clear winner of the election, as you can see here on the left-hand side, where the slide shows the percentage of the vote. and also the wins and losses compared to the last federal election in 2017. The party that currently is the largest party in the outgoing government, the Union or CDU-CSU, the Christian Democratic Party, lost heavily, while the Social Democrats, who are currently the junior coalition partner in the outgoing government, won 5 percentage points. Now, if you haven't followed German politics closely, you could ask, aren't the Greens also a big winner of this election? You see them here winning 5.8 percentage points, but they had actually been polling significantly better than the 14.8% that they did receive. So even though it's a significant increase in their vote share compared to the last election, the mood in that party was somewhat disappointed that they had not been even more successful. So I want to kick off this discussion by showing you a few basic figures, some on which my colleagues will have a chance to further elaborate. But I want to make 3 main points in interpreting the election outcome. The first is that campaigns and candidates matter, and this was really quite an extraordinary campaign that saw, as you see here in the right-hand side, a very significant shift late in the campaign. The Social Democrats, who are now considered the winner of the election, were polling around 15% for most of this year, up until early August or so. And only then, as you see, their polling began to rise towards the level of about 25–26% was their final result. And that had a lot to do with the candidates that were that the major parties had put forward as candidates for the chancellery, where essentially in a process of elimination, many voters chose the SPD candidate Olaf Scholz, not necessarily because they were so impressed by him, but because they felt the other 2 candidates had significant liabilities. Armin Laschet is the candidate put forward by the CDU and their party leader. So that is Angela Merkel's current party. But he made a number of blunders in the campaign. Some of you might have seen images of him laughing in the background while the President Frank-Walter Steinmeier was giving a somber news conference on flooding that didn't go across very well. So he did not run a good campaign, and many voters had doubts about his ability to lead the country. And the same was true for Annalena Baerbock, the Green candidate, who soon after she had been nominated as candidate by her party, had a number of issues to deal with, including accusations that she had somewhat embellished her CV. No big issues, and I'm sure a lot of sort of gendered factors played into this as well that Heather will talk about. But the result was, as you can see on the right-hand side, that from May, the polling of the Green Party only went downwards. So campaigns and candidates clearly did matter in an interesting way, and the SPD won not so much because of their program, not so much because they had such a great candidate, but because the other candidates really were seen as weak. Second insight, we have in Germany no more big parties. The CDU and its Bavarian wing, the CSU, in the last few elections were the only remaining large party, really, because the SPD, the Social Democrats, had shrunk so much in the previous election, but now they have shrunk as well. And you see here the new composition of the German Bundestag, which essentially has 4 or 5 party of similar size, and then the Die Linke, the left party, is a little bit smaller than that, but there are clearly no more big parties. And in the German political system, that means that now, after the election, all the focus is on the building of government coalitions. I attended an event on the Canadian election last week in which my colleague Bill Cross spoke, whom I respect very much, and he said, told us a similar story of no more big parties in Canada, and that might be an argument why we should think in Canada more about coalition governments. And I was thinking, well, be careful what you wish for, because what coalition government means is that even after the outcome of the election, we do not yet know who will govern Germany going forward. Because there's 2 main coalition options that are currently being debated. The one would be under the leadership of the SPD, which has the most seats, working together with the Greens and the Free Democratic Party, which is a liberal business-friendly party. But the CDU has also declared that it's interested in forming the so-called Jamaica coalition, which all of these labels reflect the colors with which these parties are associated, which would also have a majority. And which of these coalitions is formed at this point is not clear. And theoretically, if neither of them comes about for whatever reason, there would also still be a majority for the existing coalition, which puts the SPD and the CDU-CSU together in a so-called grand coalition. But that this time around would then be led by the Social Democrats because they are the larger party. That is the most unlikely option, but it's still sort of a reserve option should the other coalition options fail. Now, here I've tried to map the German parties approximately on the two-dimensional party spectrum that the political scientists often like to use, which distinguish between left and right in an economic sense, where the left would be for more state intervention, more redistribution, and so on, and the right would be more for free markets, while the second dimension is between what is often called green alternative libertarian on the one hand, and traditional authoritarian nationalist on the other hand. So this is a more cultural dimension of the party spectrum, which has become more influential in recent years. And if we map the two coalition options, the two main coalition options, the so-called traffic light coalition and the Jamaica coalition, here we can see that in both cases, two of the partners are fairly close together. For the traffic light, it's the SPD and the Greens, and for the Jamaica options, the CDU, CSU, and the FDP. But the third partner would be further away, and that gives these negotiations an interesting dynamic that in each case, one of the smaller parties has to be convinced to work with partners who would not be their natural first choice in a coalition. And that's also why it's not clear at this point which coalition will be formed. There seems to be a bit of a tendency towards the traffic light coalition at this point, simply because the SPD is seen as the winner of the election and the CDU-CSU is not seen as having a very strong case to continue governing. But at the same time, I would argue that in some respects, the differences between the parties might be easier to bridge in the Jamaica coalition. So it's not a foregone conclusion in my view, even though the tendency seems to be to see if the SPD will lead the next government. So that's an implication of the fact that there's no more big parties. And there's one third element about this insight that I want to mention. Regardless of which coalition is formed, the government will have to work with the second chamber of the German parliament, which is the Bundesrat, which is formed by the governments of the German Länder, the German states or provinces. And this is how the Bundesrat looks now. There used to be pretty clear coalitions or groupings, essentially an SPD-led group and a CDU-CSU-led group until about 10 years ago. But now you see that the governments are really all over the place because there are no more big parties, and it has to be more and more three-party coalitions that are being formed. So whatever government comes about based on the Bundestag election result, they will have to work and compromise for a significant proportion of their legislation with the Bundesrat, and that will require working with parties that are not part of the government coalition in any case. And I think Arthur will discuss that in even more detail. My last insight is about the populist appeal and its limit. Here we can observe that the Alternative for Germany, or AfD, has now been elected to the Bundestag for the second time in a row. And it's very clear at this point that they have become an established part of the German party system. And in some respects, you could say they have been quite successful because they are now the strongest party in two of the Länder, Saxony and Thuringia in the east. You can see that in these images here, which compare 2017 and 2021. And you can see them here on the blue on the right-hand side. This is the Alternative for Germany. So they are the party with the plurality of the vote in a significant region of this country. The main reason for this is that the CDU in those regions declined in vote share. So it's not necessarily their own strength that propelled them to the plurality of the vote, but it still shows that they have significant, very strong roots in part of the country. You can also, of course, see that the image as a whole has become a lot more colorful, with a lot of regions where the Green Party is actually now the party with the plurality of the vote and much less black, reflecting the losses of the CDU and CSU. But overall, the vote share of the Alternative for Germany declined. And the party, it seems, could not capitalize on its position as the only major party that opposed anti-COVID measures, which you could consider as remarkable because, like in Canada, perhaps even more than in Canada, there is a significant share of Germans who have opposed lockdowns and vaccinations and all kinds of anti-COVID measures. So you could think that the Alternative for Germany would actually have had a topic that might have worked for them electorally, but it seems it did not. And to me, that seems to confirm that it's really migration that remains the single most effective issue to mobilize the authoritarian populist vote, and migration was not a big issue this time around. So then to conclude, does this election represent a revival of the Social Democrats? I would say only in a very limited sense, because they were not elected primarily for their program or even the attractiveness of their candidate, but mainly the weakness of the other candidates. And we see as well that even if they were to lead the next government, they would do that from a relatively weak position as only one small part or mid-sized party amongst other mid-sized parties. And certainly they have also not really won in a large scale. They have not really won back some of the traditional social democratic constituency that might have moved over to the authoritarian populist right and voted the AfD, which remains established in the German party system. So I leave it at that and would look forward to your questions later.
Thank you so much, Akim. So we move further to Heather.
This is Carleton.
Hey, great. Thank you so much. Let me just get my screen share up as well. There we go. I hope that that's working and you can see it. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I always love coming back to Carleton. I have both my graduate degrees from Carleton's Department of Political Science, so it holds a very special place in my heart, I think. And I would most certainly rather be there in person, but well, the commute was a little bit easier this way, I guess, and we'll make do with what we can do. At the moment, I should recognize that I am in York region, which is north of Toronto, and I am on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. The current treaty holders of this place are the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations, and particularly the day before National Indigenous Day, I think that that's important to recognize and to acknowledge. So my angle here is that I'm going to offer a little bit of a gender-aware reading of the analysis. I don't think that I've been able to do enough real research since Monday to be able to say that this is a really in-depth gender analysis. But I do have a lot of ideas. I think we can go into more detail during the question and answer period. I'm going to focus on a few ways in which gender did and did not factor into the campaign and the results. And like I said, there's a lot more that needs to be said. And I think that there's also some very important, from a Canadian perspective, some very important cultural and multicultural questions, intersectionality that needs to be picked apart here. In that typically the German Bundestag is not exceptionally diverse. There are some interesting candidates who managed to get in. The two first, I believe the first two transgender candidates have been elected in, and I've been looking for the statistics on the number of so-called migrant background individuals, but so far these, to my knowledge, have not yet been published. So I think I'll start with representation and voter behavior. And I think what's important, I'm actually going to jump first to 2017. This is sort of the typical gender breakdown of voting in the past 2 decades or so, at least, if not going back further. And you'll see on the left the male vote, and on the right women's vote. And you notice that typically women were voting in significant amounts more for the conservative CDU, CSU parties. Men tended to vote, at least in 2017, more for the radical AFD. And most of the other parties, we can say it kind of came out more or less even. Now, what's interesting is that this was particularly evident during the Merkel era, and that particularly during the Merkel era, there was sort of a female bonus, where I think a lot of women voted for Merkel because she was a strong female leader. She did not identify as a feminist, and I think that's also kind of important to say. She was quite adamant about that even, which again, from a Canadian perspective, I think is great fun to juxtapose against Justin Trudeau, who quite adamantly has always said that he's a feminist, and Merkel, who claims that she is not. And if we look at their policies, there's something to look for there. In terms of this year's votes, men and women voted almost identically right across the spectrum. So what's interesting here is that women actually, 12% fewer women voted for the union this year, for the CDU-CSU, than they did in the past. So really a good portion of the Union's losses came from the female vote. And I think that we're going to need some more time to really look at why. Was there a particular reason that women felt that they were not being properly represented by Laschet in particular? Did they feel more drawn to Scholz or Baerbock? I don't know, but I think that it is really important to look at that. The other important thing I think to see here is that if you look at the blue bar, the AFD, the difference between the male and female vote for the AFD has gotten significantly smaller. And again, I think this is a really interesting question, and I think goes back to something that Achim was just saying around, it's really about migration. That really, when we break it down to the AFD's primary issue of migration, in that sense, there are not the same differences between the male and the female perspective here than for some of the other issues that may have been driving the AFD a little bit more in the past elections too. The other reason I think that this is kind of important and maybe fun to think about is that for 16 years, Germans have only known Frau Kanzlerin. There has been no Herr Kanzler. And there's an entire generation of young voters who actually don't even really, internalize this concept of the Kanzler as being male. A number of my friends with younger kids have sort of tongue-in-cheek posed that their kids are actually asking, "Mummy, can a man be the Kanzler or the Kanzlerin?" And so I think that there is a generational shift that's going on, and I think we do need to sort of think about what that means moving forward. Where it's interesting again is that, and Achim mentioned this as well, that Baerbock, as the only female candidate among the big parties, did not capitalize on her gender in any way. So initially the party had huge gains when she first announced her candidacy. Support for the Greens spiked to 30%, and then it dropped off again relatively quickly. And a lot of it, I think, waned because of her own errors. She made some pretty big mistakes along the way. But I also find it's really interesting that she was the only one of the leaders to acknowledge on election night that the mistakes were hers and hers alone. And I found that was, from a gender perspective, very interesting. You've got these two men fighting over who won, and the woman who says, "You know what, we did well, but it was my fault, we didn't do better." So even there, I think there's something very interesting to kind of pick apart about personalities and who the leaders are. So the other thing for the campaign has been that fact checkers have shown that Baerbock was absolutely disproportionately targeted with fake news campaigns. And again, we have to look a little bit more deeply as to where these have come from. There is some indication of Russian involvement, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. But fact checkers, one has shown that Baerbock was, that close to 70% of the fake news were directed at Baerbock, compared to about 30% that targeted Laschet and almost nothing at Scholz at the SPD. Other statistics show that the mainstream or center parties, so this is a bit more of a detailed breakdown, were generally the main targets overall, and the fringes were significantly less targeted. So there's almost nothing directed at the AfD. But it's interesting, again, that if you look at Robert Habeck, number 10, who is the co-leader of the Greens, he came in at only 4% targeting versus Annalena Baerbock of 25. So again, it's not targeting just the Greens, but very specifically Baerbock. Things like she was going to forbid people from keeping pets. She was going to end widows' pensions. She was going to take cars away. I mean, all sorts of very dramatic statements about what she was going to do. And it was specifically her that was going to do this, not the Green Party. So I think the fact that she was the only female candidate in a realistic position to become chancellor is very important in terms of this connection then to the media. But also the fact that she did not enjoy any significant support by virtue of being a woman. So the other thing to kind of think about then is the parliament itself and the representation of men and women in the parliament. So this is broken down then with the red being the women's representation and the blue are the men. And so you can see that in the Greens, in the Left Party, and in the SPD, we'll say it's roughly 50-50. Or at least 60-40. And the other three parties, the further right parties, or in the sort of upper right quadrant from the two spectrum representation, are much, much lower in women's representation. And I think this is really important when we think about how the coalitions will be constituted. So an FDP, Union, and Green Party will have a significantly lower representation of women than the so-called traffic light coalition. Why does representation matter? I think it matters that particularly right now, hopefully coming out of the pandemic, where women have been very differently impacted than men, where particularly questions of economic and labor market participation are now more gendered than we have seen for decades, that this representation is very important. And if the FDP becomes that party that is in many ways driving employment, labor market, and finance decisions, we really have to wonder what that representation, or poor representation in this case, of women might do for bringing women back into the workforce, for recognizing the need for reconciliation policies and things like that. Typically, the CDU and the CFU, sort of CDU and FDP, assume that when the economy does well, women do well. Women do well, families do well, it's all fine. But there's so much more to it, especially this time coming out of the pandemic. In terms of issues and campaigns, this is one of my favorite moments because, as I said, Merkel says she's not a feminist. Towards the very end of the campaign in mid-September, she finally, and for the first time publicly, embraced the term feminist. And I think this is very interesting that she does it right at the end of her tenure. But I think it's also important because it finally brings to light that she did make a difference, that women's policies and women's rights were in some way advanced during Merkel's tenure. Sometimes I think it was not well published or publicized that that's why it was happening. But in fact, behind the scenes, there was this sort of constant push. And I think that in the past, other parties sort of made use of the fact that she claimed to not be a feminist and sort of pushed back against feminist politics. But the fact that she has now embraced it, I think, is just a really nice little twist for the end of our campaign. The AfD in particular ran and continues to run an incredibly gendered campaign. So this is one of their posters. This one actually showed up at the Holocaust memorial in Würzburg, or outside of Würzburg, making it, I think, 10 times worse than just the placard, the poster alone would imply. The poster says German, not gender. And this is referring back to this idea of politically correct language and questioning the uses of masculine and feminine endings on nouns. But also moves towards gender mainstreaming and recognizing gender as an important part of all policy making. This has been always a part of the AfD's platform. They've been opposed to same-sex marriages, as I said, gender mainstreaming, all of these sorts of things have been key to the right-wing party. But again, they didn't seem to capitalize on any of this time. So as Achim has said, it really seems to have been mostly about migration, and this targeted gender measures really didn't seem to get them too far. Interestingly, the only two parties that really picked up on this, it was almost ignored by the mainstream, except the CDU and the AFD. And the CDU also picked up on gender in a very negative sense, this idea of the gendered language and things, and how that was going to undermine the German society and German language and German culture, but mostly do so in their social media campaigns and much less in sort of the mainstream media. So I think that it's interesting as to whether or not this will become a bigger question. But for the AFD, there's a clear link between what they call the gender insanity and the EU level. So maybe as a bit of a move into that, they really feel that the EU is pushing this sort of liberal stance, which they disagree with. They see it as taking over identity within the German state. And again, that's coming from the EU. And I think this used to be one of the things that maybe helped them to find a bit of a stronghold outside of Thuringen and Saxony, but it's not really made them exceptionally popular in the Western parts of Germany. And I think their push to get out of the EU, it was founded as an anti-EU or anti-bailout party. It's still come back in parts of the party as being very much anti-EU. So I think that this is one of the reasons that they were not successful beyond a very small corner of the country. For me, in terms of the, I'm going to stop sharing here. In terms of the possible coalitions, just to pick up on a few ideas, I too feel that the most likely coalitions are Jamaica or traffic light coalitions. I really do think that it will probably be a traffic light coalition. The Young Greens came out this morning and said that they would not support a cooperation with the CDU. Now, they don't hold a lot of power, but at the same time, it is worth thinking about whether or not in this very consensus-based society, they would actually have to take that into consideration on the bigger scale. I think either way, it's very interesting to think about what role Annalena Baerbock will play in the later government. There were some questions about who would take on the role of vice chancellor, whether it would be Baerbock or her co-leader, whose name is eluding me at the moment, at the co-leader. But at this point, they've basically said that they're not going to speak out. They're not going to say who it will be yet. And I think we'll just have to wait for that. In terms of what either of those coalitions mean for the EU, I think that there's not going to be a huge difference between the two in their EU policy. I think that, and I think this is maybe where Otto will be picking up on some of these questions in a little while, but for me personally, I think the big question then will be around the role of the banking union and sort of financial cooperation in the EU moving forward. But either way, we're going to have FDP and Greens having to cooperate. So whether that is led by an SPD or a CDU chancellor, I'm not convinced it will make a massive difference at the EU level. The Greens have a very ambitious EU program, and I think that it very well might clash with the FDP's program at the EU level. But I think Scholz is likely to be a little bit more sympathetic to the concept of a banking union than the CDU is. But I think overall, it's just wait and see, particularly wait until the French elections in the spring. So that's sort of my comments for now, and I'll turn over to Otto Benz.
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. Arthur, please. Just to remind you that you are muted.
Thank you. Okay, you hear me and you can see my screen? Great, it
Yes,
works.
yes, it works.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back at Carleton, also only online, unfortunately only online, but at least online. I think Achim and Heather, we agree on the likely outcome of the elections as to the coalitions. It's quite likely that we end up what parties have tried in 2017 with a three-party coalition. And what I want to present now is, first of all, that this is the consequence of a long-term development in Germany, which Achim has already referred to with the decline of the big parties. There are no longer big parties. And the second reason is because indeed German society has changed. And the consequence of all this is that Germany is since a long time governed as a consensus democracy. It's no longer a chancellor democracy, and that is quite in contrast to what media has shown in the election campaign when they focused on the three candidates and presented them like competitors for the presidency. This is, so to speak, a mistreatment of the German political system. And I would like to discuss a little bit how this consensus democracy has evolved and is likely to work in future. And I will end up with some comments on consequences for European Union. This is not the recent election results. You see the recent election results on the right end of the slide. It's long-term development. What you see here is the, so to speak, a change of the party system in Germany, and indeed it's a continuous trend towards a decline of the two big parties in Germany, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, and the rise of other parties, the Greens, the continuing stabilization of the Liberals with up and downs, and the change after the German unification with the Linke as a third party and later the AfD. And this is the consequence. I will not go into the details as political scientists. You are well aware about this. This is the consequence of the change in society. We have a society which is characterized by multiple cleavages, socioeconomic cleavages, and territorial diversity, which should not be underestimated in Germany. Achim has shown this on one of his slides, the east-west, north-south, and also urban regional, rural regional differences. This is not a divide like in Canada, but it reflects in the German party system because we have proportional elections. And finally, what I also want to point out, maybe this is an aspect which is important for the current elections, the CDU, CSU and the SPD have lost young voters. They are, so to speak, parties of the older people where they still are attractive. But the younger generation has changed its election behavior, and this is also an effect which is reflected in the pluralization of the party system. Now, first, what does consensus democracy mean in Germany? It's a particular consensus democracy for the reason that in Germany, we have, in a way, two kinds of negotiation systems which are institutionalized in our system of government. First, we usually have, in contrast to Canada, coalition governments, and coalitions parties have to find agreements on a program and later on decisions on policy making, both of the at federal and at the Länder level. And second, as you know, we have a particular kind of federal system, which with the consequence that in many cases, in many policy issues, federal governments and Länder governments have to negotiate an agreement. This still, despite a change of the constitution, concerns about 40% of matters in federal elections, including fiscal policy and climate policy, but it refers also to some executive tasks. I also want to mention that there is a third dimension of the consensus democracy, which is more informal. This is the interest intermediation. I will not go into this in greater detail because this is not important to understand the consequences of the current discussion. But the first one is important. Now, the practice of governing in this consensus democracy has changed over time. The perception of the German government is still influenced by research results from the 1970s, where the consensus democracy is described as a kind of antagonist cooperation, which means that the two big parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, one governing at the federal level and the other controlling the majority in the Bundesrat, they were, so to speak, in an opposition and nevertheless had to find a consensus. And of course, this is extremely difficult. And the result was that they only agreed on the lowest common denominator, and they avoided bigger reforms or bigger changes of policy making. That has changed over time. I don't want to go into the details. I only want to explain that over time, depending on the different political and social conditions, governments have, so to speak, invented different ways to manage the conflicts among parties and federal and Länder governments, either by intra-party conflict management, which was developed by Helmut Kohl and also practiced by Angela Merkel in her first two legislations. Gerhard Schröder, the Social Democratic Chancellor, worked with commissions, expert commissions, which was de facto a revival of the corporatist policymaking to define his reform agenda. And recently, Angela Merkel has mainly negotiated with the heads of governments that met in the so-called Minister-President Conference, the conference of the prime ministers of the Länder, in order to avoid that there is a veto of the Bundesrat against the federal bills. So what we should be aware of is that consensus democracy works under significant institutional constraints, which requires, so to speak, a certain creativity of policymakers to manage conflicts. And there had been practical changes in this consensus democracy. Now we have, or we will expect as a likely outcome, a three-party coalition at the federal level. And this is new. What is also new is that now we have really no longer the grand old parties or the big parties. This is also new. So parties that are in a kind of leadership position. What is not so new, but only expresses the long-term trends, Achim has also mentioned this, is at the Länder level, which then affects voting in the Bundesrat, we have two or even three-party coalitions. 8 of the Länder have three-party coalitions, 8 have two-party coalitions. What I want to highlight, however, is that still the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats have, in a way, a veto power because they participate in Länder governments which control more than the majority of the votes in the Bundesrat. And both parties are still leading most coalition governments. So they have, so to speak, the power in the conference of a prime minister conference. This is a picture Achim has shown, but here it's important that the Christian Democrats and the SPD, like, by the way, the Green Party, they are involved with in land parties that control more than the 35 majority of votes in the Bundesrat. So there's a kind of veto power because Länder government have to come to agreement on voting. Otherwise, they abstain, and this is a problem if the Bundesrat has to explicitly express its assent to federal election. Now that was too fast. What can we expect as change in the patterns of government? This is now a bit speculative, but I want to share my thoughts with you. We will have federal election, which is both multi-party and intergovernmental. That's clear. Three parties share agenda setting power as they participate in the coalition. And this is insofar a substantive change as now the liberals are in the federal parliament, in the federal government, together with the Green Party, and the federal government in a way initiates policymaking at the federal level, which also then has to be negotiated with the government. I guess that they have to change the strategy. They cannot, given the challenges of the government, to avoid conflicts. A strategy which we could also observe under the previous government. There's one opportunity, and I think this is a strategy that probably can work. They might come to package deal, meaning that they, so to speak, make an arrangement where one party agrees to a policy under the condition that another party agrees to another policy which is preferred by the other parties. It's also possible that they find a kind of a division of policy domains, which could be also expressed in the position of in the division of the ministries, but we will see. An important point which I want to emphasize, we cannot expect that the Chancellor will be a strong political leader in the sense of a presidential system. The German Chancellor was, and Angela Merkel was, very, very excellent in this respect. The German Chancellor has to be a facilitator, a conflict manager, maybe also an agenda setter, but not, so to speak, a leader in the sense of applying leadership power. What might surprise you is that I expect a decline of political polarization. This is a fact that in the former grand coalitions, we had, so to speak, a dualism between two parties. Now we have three parties, and they have to come to agreement, and they cannot play the political game of polarization. They have to come to arrangement, and therefore, that was even obvious when we saw the discussions among the heads of the parties after the elections. This was such a civilized discussions which I never saw in after the elections in Germany, and that's the reason why I expect a change in, so to speak, the political culture in Germany. But overall, I would still expect that we will have more incrementalist policy changes despite all challenges that require reforms or policy transformation. But a coalition government with three parties is not prepared to do this. The implications of Germany, this is probably more speculative. Hertha has already referred to this. I don't expect that Germany becomes the big leader like the French president. Germany will remain an important mediator in European politics. And this has also to do with the fact, as Heather mentions, all the three parties, regardless of whether the Christian Democrats or the Social Democrats will form the coalition with the FDP and the Greens. They are all pro-European in a different way, of course, but they will can deal with this. This was already so in the past. And what I expect that Germany will mediate conflicts and probably lead in certain policy fields like climate policy, maybe digitalization, probably also fiscal policy. But I don't expect that we can now see, so to speak, dualism between the French president and a German chancellor pushing the European integration. It will nothing change compared to the previous coalition. Thank you so far.
Okay, thank you so much to all the panelists. Great opening remarks. I think everyone learned quite a bit, very current and interesting subject. So we do have about half an hour for questions. So I would encourage everyone to either raise